Thank you very much. I must admit I was somewhat surprised to be asked to give this lecture, because I'll admit straight away that what I know about university higher education policy could be written on the back of a postage stamp. That said, however, there is an issue about the role of universities in our society which has exercised me to some degree for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's about that on which I want to focus. So what I want to talk about is the role that universities should play when it's faced with an electoral contest. But let me first of all, as it were, declare an interest. It's already been mentioned that I kind of spend my time, quite a lot of time, trying to explain polling and political attitudes, etc., to the wider public. A lot of this actually work has been funded more recently by the Economic and Social Research Council, to whom I undoubtedly owe a great substantial debt of gratitude. If there's anybody here from the SRC, thank you very much. One of the perhaps most prescient decisions that the SRC has ever made since it was founded in the mid-1960s was to decide in advance of the 2015 general election that it should set up an initiative to look at the UK's relationship with the European Union to start on the 1st of May 2015. Well, only 72 hours later, we discovered we had the majority Conservative government that nobody was expecting, and therefore the prospect of an EU referendum, and the initiative has been going on since. And the essential aim of the initiative is that those of us who were involved and have been involved at various stages are charged with the task of trying to inform impartially the wider public debate about Brexit, and my own particular aspect, as you might imagine, is to do with public opinion. And I've been running a website which kind of tries to bring all the polling information together and provide lots of commentary on what it all might mean. Not the first time, I must admit, I pursued that particular idea. Now, if you get an idea and you get it funded, you kind of you repackage it and do it again. But north of the border, we had had a referendum in 2014 about Scottish independence, and I'd ran a website of much the same vein then, under a very similar initiative that the SRC launched, in this case, after the referendum was called, which again was designed to provide impartial information to the wider public deemed to be of relevance to the debate about Scotland's constitutional future. Now, clearly from the SRC's view in particular, but arguably for academia in general, a crucial point of these initiatives was not necessarily to do world-breaking, 4-star, international standing original research. It was to say, hang on, those guys in the ivory tower can occasionally be rather useful, and to help to demonstrate, not least to the Treasury, that we can have, quote, impact, unquote, though I have to admit it's not a word that I like for what we do. But of course, what was also true about both of these exercises, and is currently still true about the Brexit initiative, is that it's an initiative that's had to negotiate the shoals of a politically contentious subject in a politically contentious atmosphere where maintaining neutrality and where having good lines of communication with all sides of the argument is crucial to that impartiality being accepted. So just understand that's where I'm coming from, and why, as it were, I'm going to perhaps be a little bit critical about how the universities dealt with Brexit. Because the striking thing about the universities, even though they are charitable institutions funded by the taxpayer, felt that they should indeed get 100% involved in the Brexit referendum. This is a reminder of a letter that many a university vice-chancellor signed and sent to the Independent only days before the Brexit referendum, warning of the dangers of Brexit to the standing of universities and basically calling for a Remain vote. And I've heard many university vice-chancellor, both before and since the Brexit referendum, taking a very clearly, avowedly anti-Brexit, pro-EU position. And it's the wisdom of that and the contrast between that stance and, for example, what did Universities UK do in the 2017 general election? Well, they did what you would expect any sector to do. They came up with something that said, look, these are the things that matter to us. Now, Brexit, as you can see, still appeared fairly much on that. But they're saying that these are the things that matter to us. But some of our things that, are frankly motherhood and apple pie, like, could we please have lots of wonderful students? And could we please have more money? Well, there were lots of people hoping to persuade the parties to give them more money during the general election. But that's, a relatively innocuous way of saying, look, this is what we want people to think about in the general election. But it's essentially taking a neutral stance. It isn't saying either vote Conservative because we believe in higher education fees or vote Labour because we'd like to get rid of them, although I suspect many of you had views on that subject. Perhaps the real contrast, however, between what the universities did over Brexit is with the Scottish independence referendum of 2014. Here's a reminder of a headline from the BBC website from April 2014, when the CBI Scotland announced that the CBI Scotland were in favour of a no vote. That meant no to independence. Within a matter of hours, we all of a sudden discovered that most of Scotland's universities were members of CBI, and not that many people ever realised that. And indeed, so also, by the way, was the BBC. And very, very rapidly, universities in Scotland said, not in our name, and we're resigning. Well, actually, 3 days later, CBI, realising that the importance of the public sector to the CBI in Scotland was such that it couldn't afford to lose half of its membership, decided to stand back. But here was a very different position. The universities in Scotland were very, very definitely saying, we are not taking sides. So, the question, therefore, I want to ask first of all is, why was Brexit different? Why were universities in the UK led down getting involved in the electoral fray over Brexit in a way that they wouldn't expect them to do in a general election and didn't opt to do in the Scottish independence referendum? And that's the question on which I'm going to focus most. But then coming out of that, what are the risks involved in getting involved in the electoral battle in this way? And perhaps most importantly, what are the lessons that the university sector should take on board when thinking about the future? Because to give you some idea of what I'm going to say, I don't think this problem is going to go away. Now, being a psophologist and somebody who deals in surveys, as you can imagine, my answer to the first question is going to start by looking at how those involved universities and more generally the products of universities, how their views do or do not differ from the rest of society. So I'm going to use essentially data about what those who have a degree say about various things as a surrogate for what higher education thinks about it, but as it were, what graduates in general think, those within higher education itself tend to think in spades. Okay, so let's start with the Scottish independence referendum issue. So you'll get familiar with this for a while. This is the breakdown of whether or not people voted yes or no, broken down by people's highest educational qualification. From those of you south of the border, higher equals A-level, and standard 1 to 3 is roughly what GCSE A to C, as it used to be before Michael Gove started fiddling with it. But the crucial point I want you to note is that actually 45% of graduates voted no, which of course is 45% of people in Scotland voted no. And broadly speaking, university graduates were not particularly distinctive in their views on the merits or otherwise of Scotland becoming an independent country. So there isn't anything in the university community that's particularly arguing one direction or another, and indeed, the university community is arguably clearly split on the issue. What about voting behaviour? Do graduates tend to vote differently? Well, to a degree, my lord. They tend to be, even in 2015, were somewhat less keen on the Conservative Party than, for example, those who've got other experience of higher education below degree level, or indeed those with an A level. But they're no more distinctive in their level of support for the Conservative Party than those who don't have any high educational qualifications at all, and meanwhile their level of support for the Labour Party again is not particularly distinctive in that election. So again, perhaps we should not be surprised that universities don't necessarily think it imperative to take a distinctive stance on what should happen in an election. Now, okay, something missing there, but one more go. Now, indeed, if we think more broadly about the wider terrain of public attitudes amongst graduates, one can see why we don't see an enormous distinctive set of attitudes. What I'm showing you here is data from British Social Attitudes, where a lot of this comes from, where we ask people a series of questions every year which are designed to work out whether you're left-wing or right-wing. And essentially they are questions that are designed to tap what the extent to which you think there is or isn't too much inequality in our society, and what, if anything, the government should do about it. And are you, if you're left-wing, if you're essentially somebody who thinks, yep, society's too unequal and I want the government to do something about it, you tend to be on the right. If you say, no, hang on, look, we need a degree of income variation in order to create the incentives for entrepreneurs to pursue growth. Now, the crucial, and what I'm showing you here, the left is basically the proportion of the people in each educational group who belong to the one-third most left wing, and the ones on the right are those who belong to the one-third most right wing in our society. And as you can see, essentially, university graduates, about 30% of them can be on the left, about 33% of them are on the right. They are pretty much a reflection of our society in general, and they certainly, again, don't have particularly distinctive views. But when it comes to Brexit, what we have to appreciate is that this was not an issue that divided this country by left and right. This may surprise many of you, but actually in this data set, those who one would classify as being left-wing on the dimension that I have used were actually somewhat more likely to vote Leave than those on the right. When we use the terms left and right, we talk about Brexit left and right, we are frankly using a misnomer. Brexit divided both left and right in this country down the middle. So, what was Brexit about? Brexit was about a very different set of values. It's a division between essentially those whom we might want to describe as social liberals, who one can characterize as essentially people who say, look, at the end of the day, what moral code you follow, what social mores you follow, what symbols you adhere to, what religion, if any, you profess, what language, if any, you speak, what symbols you are or not willing to acknowledge is up to you. At the end of the day, we should have freedom of choice, and these will also tend to be people who are comfortable living in a society where many languages are spoken. There's a whole variety of ethnic backgrounds and many different sources of cultural practice, etc., etc. These are people who are comfortable with diversity. But there is another end of the spectrum. People that we might want to call social conservatives, who essentially say, look, at the end of the day, if a society is going to cohere, then to some extent at least it does need a common moral code, which may indeed be enforced through the collective force of law. That at the end of the day, perhaps we do need to have a religion that binds most of us together. That indeed we do need everybody to speak English well. Actually, that there are social mores that we can reasonably expect everybody living in this country to follow. And if we don't have some of this, then the society is at risk of falling apart. Now, as you can see, it's this value dimension, which again British Social Attitudes measures every year, that very strongly demarcates Remain versus Leave. Around 80% of the most liberal section of our society voted to Remain, and around 3/4 of our most socially conservative section of our society voted to Leave. Why does this matter so far as universities are concerned? Because basically universities are hotbeds of social liberals. And indeed, the degree community in general is. As you can see here on our data, nearly 3/5 of those who've been to university and got a degree level qualification are people that we would classify as social liberals. So they're basically twice as common within the university degree community than they are in society in general. And, you know, given so far that university higher education itself is that community in spades, the numbers will be even greater for those involved in higher education. And as you can see, their views are very, very different from those of any other educational group in our society. And the Brexit vote, yes, it polarised by age, but it also polarised by educational background. So here was an issue on which universities did have very distinctive views, and those working in and former alumni of universities had distinctive views. This is also true when it comes to one of the central issues in the EU referendum, which was immigration. Most people who've been to university think that immigration is fine. I'm showing you here the answers to a couple of questions. We give people a scale from 0 to 10 and say, do you think that migrants who come to the UK from outside the UK, are they A, good for our economy or bad for our economy? And B, do they enrich our culture or do they undermine our culture? Particularly getting to that liberal conservative argument. And as you can see, in response to both questions, around 3/4 of university graduates say, yep, they're great for the economy and they are great for our culture. But at the other end of the spectrum, those with few, if any, educational qualifications go, oh no, they're not. They're not good for our economy and they're not good for our culture. Thus, it's not surprising that when it came to the EU referendum vote, university graduates voted very, very differently. Only around 1 in 5 of those with a university degree voted to leave. At the other end of the spectrum, around 3/4 were doing so. So Brexit involved values on which universities and those associated with universities tend to have distinctive views, unlike the Scottish independence referendum, unlike a general election, and meant that they were very distinctive in their attitudes. Meanwhile, of course, the culture of universities themselves is one in which internationalization has become more manifest. For those of us who've been involved in universities for as long as I have, remember the 1980s when we were all worrying about the brain drain to the US. Now, of course, British universities have been sucking in migrant labour quite substantially, and in particular, managed to get these figures out of HISA, the growth of university staff from the European Union has been a significant part of the growth, indeed the major part of the growth in university staff over the last 10 years or so. So not only are universities institutions that have this distinctive set of attitudes, but they're also operating in an increasingly international, and particularly an increasingly Europeanized academic environment. But why might all of this be happening? Why might universities and why might graduates have these distinctive views? And this is where I want to begin to broaden out the argument a bit more. I want to suggest to you that the debate about Brexit is part of a wider debate, or is an example of the debate about globalisation that's been going on not just in the UK, but much more broadly for the last 10 or 15 years or so, certainly since the financial crash of 2008 and arguably a bit before that. And that what one needs to understand is that the process of globalisation, which many people will argue is good, is perhaps one that's better for some than for others. And that anybody who is going to get dip their toe in the water of the Brexit debate badly needs to understand that. I mean, again, one saw yesterday all these debates about whether or not the country as a whole is going to be better or worse off as a result of various forms of Brexit. But arguably the analysis that is required, and some of this has been done by the academic sector, is who might lose and who might actually be better off, because different sections of our society may be affected differently. But what's going on here? Why might young graduates in particular think that the European Union is a wonderful institution in which they wish to remain? Well, the first thing, of course, is that many of them will have the labour market skills to compete in an international labour market. And indeed, also being relatively young, not only are they the kind of labour market skills that might mean that they can get a job in Barcelona or in Berlin or whatever, but of course, because of their age, they may not have the familial ties that make it difficult for them to migrate. So these are people for whom freedom of movement is an opportunity. Meanwhile, I think Paul Surridge at Bristol University has been doing a lot of work on this recently. What's also long been evident is that graduates tend to become attuned to living in a diverse society. Particularly the international climate of universities does indeed rub off on its domestic students. And they become more used to living in a culturally tuned environment. And of course, we send some people off on Erasmus schemes and all the rest of it. They also, by the way, tend to be people who are more aware of the risks of climate change and the consequences of globalisation for that. So for this section of our society, which voted to remain, not only culturally are they people for whom remaining is something with which they are comfortable, they are arguably also the section of our society which is most likely to profit from EU membership. But the other end of the spectrum are older people with few qualifications, who might, some of you might want to argue unreasonably, but they still do, fear both the existence of their jobs and certainly the returns that they get from employment, that they're threatened by international competition. And certainly more broadly, migration is not something they do. Migration is something that happens to them. These are the people who live at home who begin to discover a greater diversity of the environment in which they are living, and they go, this is the country I was not brought up in. And they're therefore culturally challenged by living in a more diverse environment. So these are people who do not regard their real interests as being lying in EU membership, and they're also culturally challenged by some of the consequences of globalisation. So we need, and I think universities above all, there should be a few out there who read your Marxism at one stage. We should realise that there are real interests at stake here, but that crucially these are real interests where, in contrast to the Scottish independence referendum, apparently, and certainly a general election, universities appear to have a crucial role and have interest themselves. So, why was Brexit different? The first, as I've suggested, is that it's a subject about which universities and those associated with universities had very distinctive views and also have distinctive interests. And that this perhaps created an environment in which a dominant social norm emerged, which is, of course, all sensible people want to remain inside the European Union, and perhaps a lack of appreciation that other, perhaps equally sensible people who don't happen to be involved with universities don't necessarily take the same view. And then perhaps also this environment was then that the risks of this environment perhaps not appreciated because, of course, all the political parties, my Conservative Party was officially neutral, but its leader was campaigning. All the political parties were campaigning for Remain. This, of course, was the establishment case. And here, of course, there was a sharp contrast with the Scottish independence referendum, which was a contest between a Scottish government and a UK government, both of which might have a crucial role to play in the future of Scottish universities, neither of which, therefore, Scottish universities wished to offend. So whatever groupthink might be going on inside Scottish universities, and I've suggested there wasn't necessarily a great deal, was tempered by the obvious risks of getting involved. Okay, so what are the risks and what should universities be doing about it in future? Well, the first and obvious risk, as I've kind of already alluded to, is that universities are seen to be out of touch with the taxpayer who provides much of their funding. And that, particularly arguably, we have to remember here, most universities are educational charities. The fact that they are charities in themselves, I think, raises questions about their involvement in the electoral fray. We don't usually expect charities to take political stances. Indeed, the charitable commissioners sometimes wrap the knuckles of think tanks, for example, who seem to be too politically aligned with one direction or another, but are hoping to profit from the taxation benefits of being a charity. So that's one obvious risk. The second, however, perhaps, is that, insofar as educational charities and as apparently repositories of expertise and knowledge and understanding, that universities got themselves in a position where perhaps they were seen to be pursuing a sectional interest rather than the public good. And that's something of which perhaps universities might have been more aware. And then, as you might imagine, for those of us who are perhaps playing a rather different role, we say that actually the risk with this is that you compromise the ability of some of your university staff to play the role with which we are comfortable, which is as neutral facilitators, inputters into the debate, trying to make sure that experts were, in fact, listened to and their expertise made available. And the risk of the university sector being seen to be playing such a partial role in the EU referendum is that indeed it helps to fuel the Michael Gove argument that we've had enough of experts, and more broadly the populist narrative that this is the elite looking after itself at the expense of the rest of us. So, what about the future? Because this isn't just a question of crying over spilt milk and saying, oh dear, didn't we make a mistake? If you necessarily accept my argument, I accept you may not. But I think there are lessons here for the future that universities need to take on board. Because broadly speaking, there's good reason to believe that this division between social liberals and social conservatives is going to continue to be a central feature of our political debate. The debate about Brexit hasn't gone away. Indeed, one of the things we've learnt in the last 2 years is how intense the debate about Brexit is, and that we now have people with an emotional commitment to one side or the other that we have long since lost from the rest of our politics. The debate about immigration, if the UK government can ever come up with a white paper about post-Brexit immigration policy, is also clearly going to be intense. But that insofar as these are but epiphenomena of the continuing argument about the role of globalisation and whether or not it does need to be tempered or controlled or more, expect this debate to continue. And also it's become a debate that's become much more aligned on party lines. The Labour Party is now the party of Remainers, the Conservative Party, the party of Leavers. And of course, there might be another referendum coming down the track relatively soon. Who knows? None of us does. There's also other social changes going on, which arguably means that the role of university education is going to be playing yet an even greater role in our society. And this is the process of digitization, which certainly, according to some of the experts, and I'm no expert in this area, is going to bifurcate our employment market much more. And at one end of the spectrum, we will have people whose essential skills are in human empathy. So there are certain things that robots, even those with automatic intelligence, can't necessarily do, which is to provide the empathy that, for example, is a crucial aspect of social care. But then at the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are supposedly creative, who are not just applying standard rules to existing procedures, which might at one stage be thought a relatively high-end job like being a doctor, but perhaps now is less so. But people who really do actually think out of the box in a way that a robot cannot be trained to do. And that's where the universities play a role. Now, if we're going in that direction and we're going to get a more polarised labour market, whether you are or are not a university graduate may also, again, be quite crucial to your views about the future of society. So I want to suggest, therefore, that the issues that confronted the university sector in 2016 don't necessarily go away, and that, therefore, maybe universities do now to think about how they should best navigate this environment in which they may find themselves as being institutions that appear to have skin in the game? And to what extent do they reasonably pursue the sexual interests that they undoubtedly have, while at the same time not putting themselves at risk of seeming to be out of touch with a society whose public good they are meant to be serving?
Thanks so much for that. That was fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions from the audience. There are microphones. I do want to come to you as quickly as possible to get your questions. I think we have about 20 minutes or so to grill John lightly now, but maybe I'll get things going if I can. And one of the things that strikes me from your analysis, John, you were very clear about the specific traits of graduates and people who work in universities that actually were playing the biggest role here, the sort of social liberalism versus social conservatism outside of university and graduate cohorts. And one of the things that strikes me of the big changes in higher education over the last 10, 20 years is just the sheer number of people who come into university and do graduate, the sort of drive towards a 50% participation rate, which just means there are many more people with a degree in society now than there were 10, 20 years ago. And I suppose a lot of us felt that Brexit was, the result of Brexit was of its moment. There were all the sort of austerity and all the rest of it that fed through to the result that came out. But is one reading of your analysis that actually, had we voted on Brexit 10 years ago, we might actually have had an even more resounding vote for Brexit, because fewer people would have had, been exposed to all the things you're exposed to at university than is the case now? Or am I reading too much into that?
Yes. I mean, in truth, one of the remarkable consequences of the EU referendum, though maybe given the experience of Scottish independence we shouldn't have been surprised, is that it seems to have turned an issue on which historically British public opinion has proven to be quite volatile into something very stable. So if you'd wanted to hold a referendum on our membership at the most propitious time, you would have held it probably in about 1991, 1992, or maybe even 1989. So there's that moment when Jacques Delors, the then president of the European Commission, persuaded the Labour Party, who had hitherto been anti-EU, remember everybody's changed their spots on this issue, was anti-EU, persuaded them that actually being inside the European Union was a good idea, because there was a prospect of getting some of the labour market regulation they could not get out of a Thatcherite Conservative government. And so we have this brief period when both parties are on side. Then, of course, no sooner had the Labour Party signed up to the European project and the Conservative Party began to fall out of love with it. It starts with a row about the Maastricht Treaty. It then pursued further by an event which people tend not to notice, but which undoubtedly begins to precipitate the movement towards more anti-EU attitudes, and that's the banning of British beef because of the concerns about Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. British beef is a British icon. Those French continuing to eat horse meat and not willing to eat good British meat is the kind of thing that doesn't give the European Union a good name. And that's the point at which, attitudes go. And then, of course, you've got the experience from, it begins around the time the Labour government goes in, and then particularly goes in 2004, is that, we do start to become a country which sucks in labour in a way which is against its long-term historical experience, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer to you is, we were against the EU until Harold Wilson asked us to vote to be in. We moved very dramatically in that referendum. We then went against it. We then kind of moved in favour when the Labour Party changed hands, and we had this period, late 80s, early 90s, we thought it was a good idea. And then it kind of began to go downhill and actually reached the bottom at around the point at which David Cameron promised the referendum, in around 2012, 2013. David Cameron promising the referendum actually improved the numbers for the European Union. It got us to the 50-50 split. Cameron's problem was he could not move it any further because he, unlike Harold Wilson, he failed in the renegotiation. So the crucial point is, yes, one can look at these demographic differences, but as we would say in the trade, there are also period effects. There are things that may go on in society that mean that both graduates and non-graduates may become more or less pro-EU. So the variation is around a different mean.
Great. So this idea that the will of the people does actually change over time, which no one seems to have mentioned to Theresa May in the last couple of years.
Well, it's been mentioned to her often, to the extent that she's now utterly irritated when she gets asked for the nth time in the House of Commons about why shouldn't we have a people's vote. But anyway.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll come on to whether there'll be a people's vote later. Does anyone got any questions in the room? Let's have a mic down here at the front. If you could just tell us who you are and where you're from and then ask a brief question. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark Huxton from Edinburgh Napier University. You've explained why universities need to be perhaps a little bit cautious to remain neutral in the political fray, but a related question in my mind is about all those people who are untouched by universities, and certainly just before the referendum I couldn't think of a single person in my family, in my friends, in my colleagues, in my students who was likely to vote to leave, which tells us something about the bubble in
Yeah,
which
that's
we
exactly
live.
the point.
So what can we do as universities to reach out to those people who are just not in our worlds?
Oh, well, that's for up to you to decide. I think that the crucial point I'm suggesting is you just need to realise, how almost inevitably your social networks are well limited. But I guess, if you want to meet the other half, why don't you go and volunteer for a food bank? Okay, you'll meet the other half of your society, or go out and do a nightly tea run for the homeless, or do any kind of charitable volunteering that would get you in connection with those who are less wealth, or go off and, it used to be called the Workers' Educational Association, but go off and do some educational work for those who've not been the joy of university. There are plenty of opportunities if you want to go and meet people who are not part of the university bubble.
Mm. I sort of referred to it in my introduction, John, but you're a classic example of a scholar whose actual academic expertise is being translated to, very large proportion of the population every time we have an election. Obviously, there are quite specific circumstances about why that's worked so well and why you've been so successful at that. But are there any lessons, do you think, that academics can learn from your success in translating quite niche academic expertise into such a big impact? Is there anything that you can pass on from personal experience?
Well, I can, though I'm not sure it's relevant to the subject at hand, but let me simply say that if you wish to learn to communicate to the public, learn to write 800 words for the Sun. If you can write 800 words for the Sun, you can communicate with the public. I.e., you need to be able to write and speak in single clause sentences that do not use any technical jargon, but then be able to convene what you say. But because the crucial point is to write in single clause sentences using simple language, you actually need to know what it is you are trying to say. And you might therefore follow from that I am not a great fan of a lot of academic verbiage, particularly in the social sciences, and I think we should just be using normal human language that most of us at least would use in regular discourse. But so that's what I would say. The other thing I would say is you need to understand news values. And news values work exactly the same way as academic theory. Academic theory determines what is interesting and why it's relevant. News values determine what is interesting and what is relevant. And if you've learnt the skill of applying academic theory in order to demonstrate why what you're doing matters and what the implications are, you should be able to translate that skill into a journalistic environment. It's just that the values are different, but the intellectual skill is exactly the same.
Got it. You couldn't put it more plainly than that. We have a question down here in the middle, if we could just get a mic into the middle. It's always said in journalism that the way to tell a story is what would you tell your mate down the pub about something. That's your top line, and then you take it.
Yeah, well, I'd certainly generally you should always have your audience in mind. And obviously, one writes differently for The Sun than one writes for the Financial Times, and that's fine. The point is you should be always thinking of your audience and making it as easy for that audience as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Martin Spence, Herring-Watt University. And I remember the...
My gosh, this is a Scottish
thing,
cabal, isn't it? Yeah. I guess we're the only people who had the tenacity to survive the Gales, because we're used to it. But anyway,
yes, indeed. And I well remember the debates about independence. I was working with University of Scotland in that element at the time with Pete Downes. touching on what you were saying, it's interesting that also the networks, I'm thinking more about social networks rather than media, or the interplay, of course, with each other are important, because part of our bubble was us all talking together through algorithm-driven things, through social media during that debate around Brexit.
Yeah.
And whilst we can engage with the various different audiences who have a different opinion through the soup kitchen and the community engagement, actually I think more powerful is probably getting into the social media community, because everybody has a phone and everybody is interacting through the social media, and it's how we get into that, I think.
Yeah, I take your point, and that one of the things that we know about social media is that people tend to follow sheep and dogs follow dogs. Yeah, though the truth is, my trade has long been talking about the extent to which that happens in society. So, for example, we used to long talk about how coal mining communities created single-minded communities that reinforce social values. So, the phenomenon is not new, but obviously the technology is different. So I suppose the other answer to, I'll tell you one other thing that I did, and I did quite deliberately in order to try to understand the discourse of those who were voting for Leave, and literally to make sure I was getting out of the university bubble, was to go to the UKIP conference in 2015 and to hear and listen to the discourse. My favourite moment was when somebody got up and said, why is it more difficult for a doctor from India to come to this country than a doctor from Germany? Which, for those of us of a certain age, remember as being exactly the same argument that was portrayed before the referendum in 1975. And a lot of these arguments have been going on for a very, very long time. So yeah, the other thing you can just do is go and listen to Nigel Farage or Jacob Rees-Mogg or whatever, and listen respectfully so you understand the argument.
If there's any more questions, put your hand up. One of the big, I'll just ask while you're passing over. One of the big criticisms of the BBC recently has been the idea of false balance, that perhaps, the climate change debate, they shouldn't have, the climate change denier alongside the scientists sort of telling it. And I think there's been some similar criticism around Brexit. Wouldn't universities potentially have opened themselves up to a whole different line of argument had they not been partisan in this debate and said, well, you should have come and told us what you really think, rather than providing sort of false...
I mean, insofar as economists within universities have expertise, let them use their expertise, and many economists did. Many economists did argue that Brexit was disadvantageous, and we kind of all know that there was only a minority that were of the opposite view. But should the BBC be demonstrating opposite views? Yes. I mean, put it like this. Let us say that the BBC had only pursued the line followed by the Treasury, that the UK was going to suffer serious economic damage the moment it voted to remain. I mean, it really would be open to criticism, because the honest truth, the Treasury, I think as the way the Treasury would put it, that the assumptions upon which they base their forecast proved to be inaccurate.
Yeah, okay. Right, question from the audience here, thanks.
Hi, I'm Justine Andrew at KPMG. Just interested in following this stream of thought and linking it to the criticism from the Minister about freedom of speech in universities.
Yeah.
And does your argument actually give credence to his theory that it is under threat, because it isn't embraced from both sides? Just interested in you drawing some links between those two sort of linked trains of thought.
Well, I mean, obviously I wasn't treading directly on that hotbed of controversy. As you might imagine, I basically think that one of the points of universities is to be places where where unfashionable views that are not necessarily currently regarded as mainstream may be developed, from which they may be promulgated, and maybe eventually they do or do not become a part. But that, above all, surely what universities should be about is thinking the unthinkable, thinking the new, making us reconceptualize the way in which we look at the world. Because if we don't do that, we're not necessarily going to make a great deal of social progress. So to that extent, at least, yes. And sure, I mean, if you go to university, you should expect to be offended, quote, unquote. I.e., what's the point? To argue with your fellow students and your academics about, I mean, you know, my constant complaint as an academic, I don't do that much teaching, but I do some, is, for God's sake, when are you guys going to stand up and argue with me and tell me I'm wrong? That's what I expect you to do. That's what a university environment is about. It's about being able to engage with ideas and to argue it, because we know the sciences are about make progress by proving, yes, today's orthodoxy wrong, and we know that the same is true of the social sciences. So, and all that, yes. So, I mean, but obviously the point, therefore, is one does, therefore, need to be aware that, yes, we will need to be respectful in universities, for example, of those who might want to argue that actually there might be reasons why the current recent levels of immigration that the UK has been sustaining are not necessarily something that one wishes to do for a variety of reasons, and that certainly those views should be respected. And I would certainly argue, indeed, I have a research project that's been getting nicely funded by the SRC designed to do this. We should certainly be trying to work hard and contribute to the debate about what post-Brexit immigration policy should be, and that may well involve contributions coming from a variety of perspectives rather than the institutional interests of the sector as a whole.
Good. Yes, in the middle. We need some questions that are going to start some arguments, and Mary, you normally oblige, so...
None of you have told me I'm wrong yet, by the way, so come on, can somebody argue against me?
Oh, well, I'm not sure I'm going to do that. Mary Kernick-Cook. I think you were suggesting that the higher education sector has basically dug itself into a bit of a hole by taking a very pro-Brexit stance during the referendum. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about how it's going to get out of that hole, or whether it's going to go on digging, and how the Academy might kind of reassert its expertise in presumably a post-Brexit future, although I guess not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is, I think the advice to anybody who's speaking officially on behalf of the university sector when they're talking about Brexit is to say, you know, we understand that a majority of the country voted to leave, and that is current UK government policy. For so long as that is the case, this is, you know, what we think, you might want to go on and say, you know, we weren't entirely happy about that, but, you know, much like Jeremy Corbyn, we accept that's the position, okay? So I think to acknowledge that that's the environment within which you are working, and then by all means talk about, then be willing to engage in the detailed policy debates. I mean, but that certainly, you know, insofar as, for example, between now and the 11th of December, we're going to have a very substantial debate. I think my advice to universities is just keep out of it as a corporate sector. And we're probably going to have an even bigger debate after the 11th of December. And my advice again would be corporately to keep out of it. But maybe what you should be doing is saying, but of course, we do have people who know about trade deals. We do know people who know about the economics of Brexit and remaining and leaving, etc. And these are the people you should be talking to and whose expertise you should be exploiting. And therefore, demonstrating how the university sector can make an informed contribution from a variety of perspectives to the important public debate through which we are currently going. And in that way, therefore, demonstrating public good.
Thank you. Question at the back.
Yes, I'm Anthony Forster, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Essex. So, John, we took your advice, and we were one of the few universities that didn't actually take a position either supporting Brexit or opposing it. And we deliberately, very consciously took that decision for all the reasons that you've set out. That actually leads me to a point where I want to perhaps take issue with you.
Sure.
Because that's now allowed us to engage on some very specific issues that as a university community, we feel very strongly about, irrespective of whether we voted to leave or to remain.
Yeah.
Such issues would relate to Erasmus Plus, social mobility, and the central importance of that to the type of education that we offer our students. A second would be researcher mobility, which we think is really important in terms of global standing of academic scholars in the United Kingdom. So I guess my point is, we feel, having not taken a position on Brexit, we are absolutely given a mandate to enter into a debate and an argument on very specific issues for government to go away and
Right,
think about.
we're actually on the same side. Notice my title was Entering the Electoral Fray. It wasn't entering the political fray, okay? So it seems to me it's perfectly reasonable for universities to be arguing that they think that so far as they're concerned, it would be advantageous if the detail of public policy took a particular form. My point is that once we get involved in the electoral fray, and particularly getting involved in the electoral fray on issues on which our society is divided, polarised, and indeed is kind of split 50-50. Now, all of which apply both to the Scottish independence referendum and the Brexit referendum. It's at that point that we should be standing back. We have decided, for good or ill, that that's for the public to get involved in. It's therefore an issue of political controversy. Charities keep out of issues of political controversy at that sense. They maintain. So I'm arguing for neutrality at the ballot box, not necessarily neutrality in Whitehall, when engaging with Whitehall.
I think the refinement then to your thesis is that universities can and indeed should have a corporate institutional role to play, that role should not interfere in a rather electoral partisan set of considerations. And then secondly, it should be absolutely important for universities to be empowering academics to speak out using their expertise. And I think I would say, and empowering academics who themselves wish to take a very personal position on Brexit, one way or the other, should be something that institutionally we are supporting.
Yeah, I would just add one other thing to that, which is that a good lobbyist understands the arguments of those who do not agree with you, and that, as it were, insofar as perhaps by compromising on some of the issues, you end up with something that might get a broader consensus. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So, in other words, I mean, particularly what I'm saying is that it's important to understand the arguments and the reasoning and the interests of those who do not agree with you, and that surely, above all, that's something that universities in particular ought to be relatively good at.
We're coming to the end of the time, John, but I'm going to finish, if I can, by asking you three possibly impossible questions, which I've saved for the final question in true journalistic fashion. Ask the most difficult questions last. You're obviously known for being an incredibly astute political crystal ball gazer. So my three questions are, will there be a second referendum? What question should we ask if there will be? And what will the result be?
At the moment, we are certainly not going to get a second EU referendum because the votes are not there in the House of Commons. If the Labour Party changes its mind and at official level comes out in favour, the current House of Commons might perhaps vote in favour of one, but it's far from clear. The DUP are against a second EU referendum. There are some Conservative MPs, actually a few of them are Brexiteer orientation as well as a Remain one, who'd vote in favour, but I suspect there are many fewer Conservative MPs who'd vote in favour of a second EU referendum than will rebel on the meaningful vote. And one also suspects that there are more Labour MPs who would rebel against their party's line on a second EU referendum than will necessarily do so on the meaningful vote. So even if the Labour Party changes turtle, for so long as we're talking about the current House of Commons, getting a second EU referendum may not be that straightforward. I leave it to society to decide as to what it should be about, but it's fairly obvious that the only campaign that's come out in favour of a second EU referendum is Remain versus Leave in some form. And the only way it's going to be possible to hold one for all practical purposes is one in which Remain is one of the options on the ballot paper, because in order to be able to hold an EU referendum, we will need to have to delay the Article 50 process, and it will only be in the interest of the European Union to agree to that if, as a result, there is a possibility that we either will end up with a softer Brexit or no Brexit at all, because that ultimately is where the European Union's interests lie. As to what the outcome would be, highly uncertain. The opinion polls, most of them have a small Remain lead. On average at the moment, it's 53-47. But much of that lead is, well, very little of that lead is generated by Leave voters switching to Remain and doing so in greater numbers than Remain to Leave. There's very little of that. It's primarily generated by the views of those who did not vote 2 years ago, who are disproportionately young, who are about 2 to 1 in favour of Remain if they express a view. So much could depend on the turnout, though of course much would also depend on the circumstances in which any EU referendum were actually to be called.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And please do join me in thanking John for what I think was a really, really fantastic first teaching lecture. Thank you. That was great. Thanks very much. Really appreciate that.